Welcome to Things You Don't Know, the podcast that seeks to bring to you little-known information about well-known people and events, and little-known people and the impact that they have had as well as events too. Sometimes just kind of seeks to entertain, but always with a view to tying it to current events. Today, this is one of Dr. Dineen's pet projects and one of his favorite things. And it's kind of cool, okay? And, you know, we've done a lot of interesting topics. This one has some real importance historically, politically, and many other ways. And I'm not going to steal your thunder. Sean, go ahead and introduce this topic.
Thank you, Bill. Today, we're going to explore some very interesting questions. For example, could you bargain with someone who just killed your best friend? Could you help someone who had just robbed you? Throughout history, there have been people and nations forced in the name of their survival to make agreements with bitter enemies.
What? Did I hear you correctly?
You did. Don't worry, I'm not falling into the realm of the supernatural.
Well, neither am I. You did have me kind of worried there for just a moment.
Sorry about that. We're going to be looking at what's called deals with the devil. It's also known as a Faustian bargain, from its most famous practitioner in literature. And these terms refer in a framework to a person, or as we're going to be looking at, nations, that does something against its core principles to accomplish a greater goal in a time of national crisis. The podcast today is going to look at 4 nations that had to undertake alliances, restrictions on liberty, and other actions they would have scorned at most ordinary times. Each of these nations engaged in these compromises to avoid a disastrous outcome. 3 of them had to partner up with abhorrent political dictatorships against the common enemy, and the 4th had to severely, temporarily, thank God, abridge its most valued political rights and freedoms in order to secure the survival of the nation from terrorism and internal sabotage. These 4 nations are Cambodia, Canada, Finland, and India. The leaders who controlled, or in the case of India, wanted to control these great nations, risked political ruin from making the arrangements they felt they had to.
You know, we could have compiled a list of probably 20, at least, instances of this. We focused on these because the impact that they've had on history as it goes forward, and also, well, they're familiar to us, and we had to restrict it somehow. So while we're looking at these, I want to encourage our listeners, check it out. This is a really interesting topic. So anyhow, getting back to our point here, why was this necessary, these compromises? All of these nations were in grave crises. India was trying to gain its political independence after 4 decades of colonialism. Cambodia was caught up in the proxy war of the superpowers in Vietnam. Finland had to embrace the most evil man in the 20th century to save its political life from destruction at the hands of a different monster. And peaceful, democratic, first world Canada was facing legitimate dissent devolving into violence. This podcast is not one of Dr. Dineen's world civilization classes, so he will spare you all of the details, but you need to have some of them.
I promise, folks. However, as Dr. Weaver said, a certain amount of background is needed.
Absolutely. We should look at each of these nations' deals separately.
I think Let us start with Finland. Finland had spent centuries walking a tightrope between Germany and Russia, both of whom coveted its vast natural resources and its very disciplined and well-educated population. Most of Finland had been a Russian colony prior to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. The opportunity for Finnish independence came about as a result of that conflagration called the First World War and the Russian Civil War that happened in the middle of it. Anti-communist Russians and Finns, known as the Whites, were able to save Finland from being taken over by the Soviet Union, Communist Russia. The George Washington of Finland was a man named Field Marshal Gustav Mannerheim. Mannerheim is a great leader. He was mentored and protected by the great white Russian leader, Marshal Anton Denton of the Russian Imperial Legion, and he began a 5-decade-long fight first to gain and then to keep Finland's freedom. Finland gained its independence in late 1918.
Yeah. Newly communist Russia, Soviet Russia, eagerly sought to reestablish Russian hegemony over former Tsarist territories. Repeatedly, over the next 20 years, in both political and military service, Mannerheim and his protege, future president Risto Rite, kept the country's defenses strong and sought to maintain a free society. Beginning in the mid-1930s, the crisis of the Depression, of the worldwide depression, made that extremely difficult, as communist leaders on the left and various brands of fascism on the right began growing in large numbers through Europe. Stalin wanted to restore the Russian Empire under the Soviet tag. He carved off Finnish territory as a sideshow after Mannerheim refused Soviet quote-unquote protection. Mannerheim despised both Hitler and Stalin, in part due to his Lutheran background. Through the lens of his Christian beliefs, he saw both Hitler and Stalin as evil. He had hoped for aid from Australia and the UK, but to no avail. Remember, there was a lot of things going on here. Hitler, well, he wanted allies for his great master plan. In early 1939, Mannerheim searched in vain for another solution, but he couldn't find one. Therefore, he made his Faustian bargain. He would fight for Germany, but under conditions.
I am neither Marshal Pétain nor that clown Mussolini, Mannerheim declared to the Finnish Senate. He refused to fight against the Western Allies, only against Soviet Russia. Over the next several years, he refused to damage Finland's democratic tradition, insisting in time of war of maintaining democratic elections and a free press, maintaining equal status for Jews, refusing to even undertake the economic discrimination practiced by Romania and Hungary, much less the ghettoization and the mass murders of the Holocaust. Even while fighting the Russians, Finnish soldiers on Mannerheim and President Rite's orders would capture Jews, even from slave labor camps, and turn them over to Allied forces, thus saving them from the death camps. 100,000 men were saved from the Nazis by the Finnish-German ally.
India's path was very different. Subas Bose, a struggling civil servant, dissatisfied with the colonial system in place, sought to bring his people to freedom through an alliance with German and Japanese tyranny. Bose, who was a civil servant and the mayor of Calcutta, enlisted in the anti-colonial struggle during his adolescence. He became a prominent member of the anti-colonial Indian National Congress. After many years, some Indian people wanted a faster movement towards independence. The great leaders of the struggle, Nehru and Gandhi, believed in nonviolence and appealed to the UK's moral consciousness and gradualism. In other words, Nehru and Gandhi's path was not moving at a fast enough pace. So they wanted something to expedite this. So Bose took a different approach, focused on the path that other nations, like particularly Japan, had taken to gain freedom while abandoning their own culture.
Bose provided a voice for people that desiring immediate independence. The British colonial leader, Viceroy Ligenthal, had declared war on the Axis powers without consulting any Indian political leaders. Bose sought to work with the Axis on the grounds that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But this was not the only reason for his bargain. The Nazis based their racial hierarchy on the ridiculously discredited idea of Aryan supremacy. There had been an invasion of India by Germanic Ukrainians approximately 3,000 years ago. Thus, the lighter-skinned Indians were seen by the Nazis, at least partially, as being part of their master race. Some aspects of Orthodox Hinduism come from this earlier invasion. It's a parallel situation to what exists in the American creation of segregation after the Civil War to limit the freedom of formerly enslaved people. The vast majority of the Indian soldiers believed in democracy and fought for the Allies.
I want to interrupt you here. When you say that it's a parallel situation to American creation of segregation, how so?
Well, there's always an attempt to create a hierarchy. The people that wish to be dominant want someone else to look down on, to either serve them or not be in their presence, not be worthy of the privileges they believe their skin color or their other status has given them. So this is an attempt to corrupt an idea for exploitive purposes.
I find it fascinating that this is based on, as you just mentioned, skin color. So in other words, white or Caucasian people are considered to be better. It's fascinating to me how Hitler and that those people were able to somehow say Japanese people were okay, and even though the Indian people were darker skinned, they were okay if they were the lighter skinned of their darker skinned people. I mean, this is crazy stuff, isn't it?
It certainly is. And that's why the vast majority of the people wanted nothing to do with it. So, as I say, 100,000 joined the Allied cause based on the UK's promise of independence at a future date. A smaller number, about 15,000, fought in the Indian National Army, which was led by Bose, and 3,000 soldiers served in the Nazi-run Free Indian Legion. Now, Subas Bose had meetings with Axis leaders. He met with Hitler in 1941 and the Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo in early 1942. These two leaders signed a treaty of alliance with Bose's government in exile and promised him he would rule the entire Indian subcontinent after victory.
You said Bose was in exile. Where was he exiled to?
He actually was in exile in Japan. And he has this meeting with Hitler and then with Tojo, and sets up a government in exile that declares itself part of the Japanese Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Wow. Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead, sir.
Oh, no, it's fascinating. So the first major project of the German army, the so-called Free Indian Legion, was supervising British and Australian prisoners, building the famous Bridge on the River Kwai. That was a movie with Alec Guinness and Peter O'Toole in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
And Bose's INA group serves as a military force in two major battles at Ampal and on the Gigantok Plain in early 1944, when Japan, with the help of its Burmese allies, invades India. And that army takes 1,500 casualties, 800 dead and 700 wounded in these two battles, while the Indians that are under the command of the Germans guard prisoners and build the Atlantic Wall. By this time, the Axis forces are collapsing, so the headlong run to the defeated Japan causes the structure of Bose's government and military to break down. He actually dies fleeing in a plane crash in Taiwan that was then controlled by the Japanese. He's burned to death 2 days after the war ends. He's buried in Japan. The British were going to conduct treason trials against the rank and file members of his army, but India was rapidly on the path to getting its independence, which it got in 1947. So the protests by the leaders of soon-to-be independent India led to an end of those trials. Now, before we go on, if you wish to know more, my friends, there are some more details in our book, Things You Don't Know, which is available on Amazon.
Okay, let's shift here. Let's take a look at Cambodia, which has a millennium-long history. Cambodia emerged from French colonialism in 1953 under the leadership of Sihanouk, Prince Sihanouk. This ended isolation from Asian affairs. He sought to avoid the clash between the West and the communist powers. Prince Sihanouk believed most of Southeast Asia was destined to be under the control of authoritarian leaders, communist or not. And there are reasons for that, which we really don't have the time to get into, but it is a fascinating thing. I recommend that you check it out. New or underdeveloped societies did not care as much about political liberty as economic development and order. Particularly, the Asian mind seems to really want to see things be orderly. And involved with that is also a kind of a not wanting to change how things had been for so long. The Prince, Sihanouk, was distracted by his legendary love life and avocation as a filmmaker. Yeah, he was in filmmaking. In 1954, the French withdrew from Vietnam, and under our President Eisenhower's direction, American forces as, quote, advisors took their place. In 1955, Vietnam was partitioned between Ho Chi Minh's communist North and the authoritarian South under Diem. An interesting side note here. You may not know this, but Ho Chi Minh, where do you think he was educated? He got his degree from University of Chicago in, yes, the US of A. And that could take us off on another rabbit trail. It's really interesting, and maybe we'll do a podcast about that in specific at some point in time. But anyhow, 4 years later, the Viet Cong guerrilla movement began terrorism and low-scale attacks on South Vietnam.
And these attacks were going to affect the other two nations of Southeast Asia that had formerly been French colonies, Laos and Cambodia. So by 1963, a group of largely French-educated intellectuals created a Cambodian guerrilla movement. This group was known to itself as Angkor, which means the council in Khmer, after the famous Angkor Wat temples, but it was known to the world as the Khmer Rouge. Following Diem's death that November, guerrilla warfare begins on a large scale also against Cambodia. And the prince is being advised more and more by his cousin, a man called Marshal Lanal, who begins to rise very much in both the support of the people and in the intrigues of the Cambodian royal court. Sihanouk was walking a tightrope playing both sides. He took financial payments from John McComb, the director of the CIA, and Kang Sheng, the head of the mainland Chinese People's Security Bureau, their secret police. The communist Chinese also supplied the prince with a steady stream of girlfriends. He had 5 official wives and who knows how many unofficial relationships. In 1969, the newly inaugurated U.S. President Richard Nixon begins bombing Viet Cong base camps that are in Cambodia while beginning the process of what he called Vietnamization, withdrawing American troops from Vietnam. And the prince sort of looks the other way and tries to renew relations not only with the U.S. but with the Western world in general. By early 1970, Lanal is prime minister, and his brother-in-law, Prince Sihanouk, serves as a regent. Prince Sihanouk is away for an obesity cure in mainland China. He was addicted to coconut-sweetened cola drinks, and he drank so much of that he was over 100 pounds overweight at the time. And the people start getting very annoyed at what they see as the domination of the economy by South Vietnamese businessmen, as well as arguments over which sects of Buddhism the Vietnamese, as opposed to the Cambodians, practiced. So this starts to get out of hand, and anti-communist forces coalesce around Lanal, who wants to take a more active pro-Western stance. And in March of 1970, he launches a military coup. Sihanouk exploded. His well-known judgment deserts him. And the bargain between the well-meaning monarch and his deadliest enemies starts to come to pass, because the only resistance to the new republic is the Khmer Rouge. And Pol Pot, the main leader, and his chief propaganda expert, a man called Hu Sampan, understood they themselves, with all their extremism, were not popular enough or even well-known enough to retain political power, even though they thought they could temporarily seize it. The lion soldiers of even the Khmer Rouge were loyal to Sihanouk, what they called Serum Pancha, that means the Papa Prince, and they had no real awareness of the insane plans of the elite to forcibly relocate everyone out of the cities, abolish money, imprison people for wearing glasses, and to create a romantic idea of a self-sufficient economy.
The average Khmer Rouge soldier was anti-North Vietnamese. Somehow that gets lost in what we know about Vietnam. But yeah, the average Khmer soldier was anti-North Vietnamese. The United States might have been able to make the rank and file allies, but we didn't. American officials hoped for a government of national unity, since the Lon Nol government was very corrupt. But such was not to be. By 1975, the government of Lon Nol was collapsing. The prince was brought to the capital to receive the people's homage and imprisoned in a gilded cage. Prince Sihanouk, refusing to find happiness under the sky, stayed behind and was brutally murdered. 4 years of chaos, torture, and mass imprisonment followed by a Vietnamese invasion to promote their dictatorship, which was by Marxist standards sane.
A 15-year tripart civil war then happens, my friends, between the Vietnamese, the Khmer Rouge, and the now elderly prince. Prince Sihanouk, under UN auspices, returned in 1991 and was elected head of state in 1993. He maintained that role till 2004 and passed away at the age of 90 in 2012.
The first country in the discussion of bizarre political deals today has been a player in other podcasts. Check out the stories of Harry Washington and Viola Desmond for details. Our neighbor to the north, Canada, had a large number of French-speaking people who had been somewhat marginalized by the Anglican British-descended elite. Frustrated radicals scorned the democratic process and began a series of bombings and bank robberies. The separatists wanted an independent Quebec republic run on socialist ideologies. In December 1963, the Front Liberation Québécois was formed. Over the next 7 years, 4 banks, 2 government offices, Eaton's, the largest chain store in Canada, and the first McDonald's in Montreal were robbed or bombed. Local businesses were paying $8 million in protection money to avoid being assaulted. By September 1970, the 1,000-man squads of the FLQ decide on an audacious plan. Cadres would take hostages and extort ransom money from the government. Several high-ranking politicians and business executives were considered by the FLQ for kidnapping.
Instead, British diplomat and trade commissioner James Cross was dragged out of his Canadian residence on October 5, 1970. The government of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau refused the ransom demand. The ransom was to be $10 million, the release of 30 political prisoners, and safe passage to Cuba. A large public swell for action began. Even pro-French political organizations like the Union Nationale political party and the Catholic Order of the Sons of John Baptiste condemned this vile act. On October 10th, Laporte himself is kidnapped. After a week, he manages to break a window, cut his bonds, and throw himself out of the window, shouting for help. Dieu, aide, s'il vous plaît, aide-moi, God, please help me, help. But only his captors heard. Minister Laporte was dragged back into imprisonment and bled to death. Trudeau had reached the end of his patience. With the support of Quebec Premier Robert Barbarossa, Trudeau suspended habeas corpus, arrested 465 FLQ supporters, put tanks on the street corners of Montreal, and dispatched 2,000 troops to protect the National Parliament in Ottawa. The document authorizing all of these restrictions on liberty, the so-called War Measures Act, allowed for detention without trial for a year.
Shades of the American Patriot Act. This was the Canadian government's bargain. It would fight for survival by ignoring traditional democratic concepts temporarily in the name of the greater good. That good was the preservation of Canada as a whole. Pierre Trudeau had liberalized Canadian society, increasing social programs, nationalizing natural resources, and opening his country to young men from the USA who didn't wish to fight in Vietnam. But he would act to save his country without regard to conventional methods.
2 months of searches and police interrogations finally led to results. James Cross was finally released after 62 days in captivity. As part of the negotiation, one member of the FLQ Leadership Council, Paul Rose, is charged with kidnapping, convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The other 5 members are amnesty and given safe passage to Cuba. After 9 months of destruction and chaos, order was restored to Canada.
So, what lessons can be learned here? Well, the press of events and the idea of a greater evil being avoided leads to these deals. But we must remember these arrangements must be time limited and not resorted to easily. Circumstances may press people to seek outlandish alternatives to avoid what they assume to be unacceptable outcomes. It is always necessary to think about more than the short-term outcomes, but to consider the effects of alliances and actions and the long-term effects that they might have.
I couldn't agree more. And I encourage all of our listeners to do research on these four topics. There's tons and tons of information on all of them. And we just don't have the time to bring it out, but you will learn a great deal. And I want to thank all of our listeners for your support over these past 16 months.
Yeah, we have some really exciting things coming up. We're in the next a few days here, a week or so, we will have the first part of the football podcast up. That's going to be kind of interesting. A lot of information that we've uncovered that is really not very well known. And yeah, hey, just a tease. Did you know that football was mentioned in the Bible? Or that the ancient Greeks had a game very similar? Hey, yeah, that's some really cool stuff. Anyhow, do stay tuned, listen in, and hey, we would really appreciate it if you would give us a like. We love hearing from you. We would love to have you subscribe. If you have a comment, feel free. We really do like to hear from you. If you have suggestions for other podcasts that you'd like to see, don't hesitate to put those down. If you have comments or anything about what we've said, please feel free. We thank you once again, and TTFN.
Good night, my friends. Thank you so much.